All right, let me refresh this page. Looking at where we're at. Okay, so we're sitting at Friday. For today, I'm going to be going over how to add and remove data programmatically from Firestore. So that's the thing I'm going to talk about today. You should have finished up with phase 2 of the game library yesterday, and so today you should be working on phase 3. So we're going to continue on with that movie library project, and then I'll have you working on phase 3 for this. There's some reading material related to that as well. For Monday, just a reminder, Monday is President's Day, so we will not have class. There's no class on Monday. That means the due date for phase 3 is due the 22nd, which I think actually I may have put the wrong thing on here. Yes, I did put the wrong number. Yes. So that phase 3 is going to be due on the 22nd. Okay. So slides I've got for today. This is posted on Inside Ranken. I'll go ahead and give a link to it on Discord as well, so everybody can follow along. So my main 3 objectives today for what I'm going to talk about is how to programmatically add documents to Firestore, how to programmatically delete documents from Firestore, and also a bit about server timestamps, namely to track the time when events occur, namely when you add data to the database. So that's one thing that will be in there. In terms of looking at where this information comes and reading material, I would refer to the add data documents as well as the delete data page. That's where I'm pulling most of this information from. Okay. There's some additional information on both of those pages that I'm not covering in this section. So, for instance, there's some information in adding data about how to update or edit documents that I'm not including today because I'm just focusing on the add and the delete and not the update. So there is additional information there on a few of these topics. I also will mention that the code examples that I have in these notes are different from what's in those articles. One thing for sure is I'm using Lambda functions, which is kind of my preferred way of doing things over anonymous classes. It leads to a much shorter syntax, as well as I'm just occasionally calling different functions in there. So let's look at how do we do some of these things. So I'm going to start with how do we add documents when we're working with Firestore. I'm going to zoom in on this a bit. So in terms of adding documents, there's a few ways that we can do it. Okay, the simplest is using document reference.set. The way we do this here is we build up the data we want to add. So here we're building it up in a hash map. So a hash map mapping from strings to objects, because in Firestore the keys always have to be strings, but the object can be a variety of different, the values can be a variety of different types. So that allows us to do that. So I create a hash map. You'll see I'm creating with that type. On the right, you'll see I'm not including the type information. That's again shorthand from Java, where you don't have to put that. It just figures out from what's on the left side with equals. Okay. But implicitly over on the right, between those greater than and less than, it's string object. It's just figuring that out implicitly. So into that hash map, I'm setting 3 values. I'm setting the name to Los Angeles, I'm setting the state to California, and I'm setting the country to USA. So now I have a hash map with 3 keys, and those are the values. So you can think about if I add a document, that document's going to have those 3 values. Make sense? Okay. So next thing I need to do, kind of like we did with the querying, is anytime we're working with the database, we're going to start with db.collection. We're going to say, which collection do you want to work with? So here I'm adding data to the cities collection. If I was adding data to games, that would be collection games, etc., etc., etc. So you say which collection you want to add it to. Next thing I'm doing is I'm saying what document do I want to write? So I'm writing a document with ID of LA. That's what's happening here. So we say in the collection cities, find the document LA. Okay? And then I'm calling set, and set says replace that document called LA, with this document that I'm providing. So whatever is there, if that document's already there, it will remove it. If there's not a document with the ID of LA, you'll get a new document with the ID of LA. So it'll either create a document or overwrite it. From there, you always want to make sure that that operation succeeded or failed. So you want to add an on-complete listener, which will listen to the results of that operation. Okay? The results of that operation, if we're calling set, is always going to be a task void. So void meaning that there's no data, no additional data that's coming back. There's no result value. It's an error or not. So we can ask, is it not successful or successful? Task successful or not successful will tell you one way or the other. And so you just need to indicate to the user and do accordingly if it failed or if it succeeded. More than likely, most of the time, this will succeed. Most of the time, this is likely to succeed. So things you can try, you might try disconnecting from the network. You might try doing different things there. So do be forewarned that you do need to check that. You do need to have this logic in here. You just may find that that case is pretty rare. The case where the writes fail is pretty hard to reproduce. Just one heads up. Okay. I'm still looking for that because defensive programming, you want to code for the things that can occur, even if you can't necessarily make them occur. Okay? So just that principle there. So I'm expecting that some way, shape, or form that you show maybe a snack bar and you log the error, that's really sufficient for me. If you show a snack bar and log the error, that's enough most of the time. Then otherwise, okay, this is successful, we can proceed. One thing to be aware of, we talked about this third semester, there's this idea of synchronous programming versus asynchronous programming. Recognize that there's a little bit of asynchronous stuff happening here. So if I write code immediately after this, that code is actually going to execute before the database has been updated. If I write code after this, then that code is going to execute before this is finished running. Okay. The operation to add the document, set the document, that's only been completed once we're in this on-complete listener, right? So this outer part, right, this, we call this, we tell it to go initiate, this just tells it to initiate that operation. Until you're in this callback, you don't know the operation has completed, okay? Does that make sense? One gotcha, I don't know if I've talked about this yet, but Java does not have the idea of promises. There's no real equivalent to promises in Java. So this is something that in other languages I might do with some sort of async await sort of setup if I were doing this in JavaScript. But this callback structure is the only way you can do that. That does mean you may have heard the term maybe callback hell from the world of JavaScript when we were talking about Node, right? Where sometimes you can get callbacks nested inside of callbacks, nested inside of callbacks. That's going to happen sometimes. That's going to happen sometimes where we will have to nest callbacks within each other. There's not really a way around that because there's not promises. The best thing I can recommend for you to avoid that callback hell is rather than trying to put all your code here, oftentimes it can be worth calling a function. And if you have this then call the function, then you don't end up with deeply nested structures. Does that make sense? So oftentimes you may want to break things down further into smaller functions to avoid nesting a bunch of functions very deep. That's callbacks. Cool? So keep that in your back pocket. Now, sometimes, remember this is going to either create a new document if it doesn't exist, or it's going to overwrite a document that does exist. Sometimes I may want to merge the data that I'm passing in with the existing document. So I may want to say, hey, I just want to add the capital field to that document. That's what this would be doing. If there's already a DJ document, then we're going to add just this data. It's going to be merged into that existing document. The way that works, we just, instead of the set just passing the data we want to insert, we pass in set option stop merge. That just says merge the data instead of override it. Yep.
Oh, so data, if you just say data,
then it replaces
everything.
It replaces everything. So, for instance, if you look here, if there was a document that was already there that had like capital, well, we're not setting capital, so the capital field would be removed. Versus here, if I'm saying this, I'm adding a capital or setting it, but I'm not. If there's already a name or a country, those things will stay there. That's the difference. Is any fields that are already there will stay there. Versus if I do it without that, then all the fields that I'm not changing will be removed. Okay. So this is some way is a little bit more safe in some sense. In that it means that you're less likely to lose data, but it also means that you're potentially having other fields in that document which you didn't expect to be there. So it's a trade-off. It depends on what you're doing. Which of those two approaches is better? Okay, but both of those are an option. Another way we may, both of those kind of presume, though, however, that I know the ID of the document I want to add beforehand. Okay, so which makes sense if I was, say, inserting a user and I'm using their username as the key. Then I can kind of know their ID ahead of time. Or if the user's entering the ID for the game, which we kind of did manually through the console, well, then you can do that. Oftentimes, we end up in a situation where I need to use that auto-generated ID, where I need to have it automatically give an ID to the document that I'm inserting. Okay. The way we do that is just a slight switch. Rather than calling set, I call add. Also notice I'm just calling collection. It's collection add rather than collection document set. So I'm not setting a document, I'm adding it. Difference there is that will then give it a randomly generated value. Another thing on the autocomplete listener that this changes, if you call add, it does give you back a document reference instead of the board. Okay. Reason it does that is because that document reference now includes the ID that it actually inserted as. That's the difference. Is if you're doing add, you're going to get a document reference. If you're getting set, you're not getting a document reference because you've already called set on the document reference. Because that document call returns a document reference. Okay, so you can do that. Also, that means the other way that you can set there's another way that you can set things with an automatically generated ID, and that is to do the first part, db.collection.document. And notice I'm calling document without an ID in there. So that gives me back a document reference that refers to the ID I'm about to insert. Right, so this refers to the place in the database where that document will be inserted. So I can do that, and then later save that document reference, and then later do the actual set down here. And at that point is where I'll figure out what the actual ID is. Okay, so you can either do it that way. You can use add, or you can say, let's call document, and then later call set. Either of those approaches work for adding a document with a random identifier. One thing to watch out for, these auto-generated IDs don't really have any implicit ordering. They really are random. Okay, so that means I can't presume that if I order it by the document ID, that will order it based on the time that the documents were created. Okay, so if I need to order things by the time that they were created, those documents need to have a timestamp that tells me when. It tells me when they were created. That make sense? So I just need to usually have a field in there that tells me what it was created if I'm going to order it by that creation date. Okay? And that also comes back to something I said the other day, in that normally, especially when you're doing this, you're going to want to have some sort of order by clause, because the default is that it orders it by the document ID. Okay. So that's how you can add data. You've got a few different ways to add data there, using a hash map, using that map structure. So we saw 4 different ways that we can write and accomplish the same task. Oftentimes you may also want to use those classes that we created previously to maybe read the data. We can also use those custom classes to write the data. So let's say I define a document class. So here I've got a city that's got a bunch of pieces of data: ID, the name, the state, the country, the capital, whether or not it's the capital, the state capital, what the population is, what regions it's in. One thing I might note here is something that I found out that this week that wasn't actually in the documentation, is this @document ID annotation. Whatever you have in your class that's the ID field, make sure that you add the ID, or supposed to be the ID field for the document, make sure you add that. What my experience was is when I pulled down the movies and I looked at what was in there, the ID of the movie was actually coming up null until I added that. So that was something I forgot to do, I guess, was it Tuesday or Wednesday we went through that? I think it was Wednesday. So Wednesday we went through that and built up the movie list. I forgot to add that document ID annotation on there. So that's something you want to go back to your lab project and make sure you add that annotation. Cool. Okay, and that just tells it that you want to use that column as the ID of the document instead of a field of the document. So once I've got my class, I can create an instance of it, and then I can start filling in data. So here I'm filling in the ID is LA. I've got the name is Los Angeles. The state is California. Country USA. It's not the capital. 5 million population, and it's in the regions West Coast and Source South. So I have an object with data in there. Okay. From there, actually I can do just what I did before. I can use set. I can say document, set it to, here's the document.id, so that's LA. And then rather than passing a map to set, I can just pass this object. So I can just pass a city in there because it turns out, well, set actually takes any object you want to pass into it. So I can pass just the city object instead of a map. That can be more convenient if you're trying to create a brand new object and you're trying to be strictly typed and all these kind of things. This may be more convenient. I would still recommend using the map approach if you're only trying to update or change some of the fields. If you're trying to add a brand new document, this can actually be much more convenient. But if you're trying to just change a few fields, I would not recommend doing this. Does that make sense? So the other approach is better if you just want to update some of the data. This is better if I'm creating a brand new document. Okay, so I can either use set or you can use add. I can use add and pass the city directly to it. Either one will work. Okay? So this, if I want a random ID, this way I would go down if I want to, if I know that ID is LA. Okay? Questions? Does that make sense so far for adding data? So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. There's a bunch of different ways that Firebase does support. Okay. Next up, let's look at the server's timestamp. Oftentimes, when I'm creating a document, I may want to track when that document was created. This is something we did a lot in third semester. I kind of showed you how to set this up. So this is the way we set it up with Firebase. When if I'm taking the map approach, I need to add another field. I can name it whatever I want. So here I'm naming it created on. And I pass in something special. I pass in field value, which is a class as part of Firebase, field value dot server's timestamp. So that's a special object. It actually doesn't have the timestamp in there at that time, but it says, okay, when this document gets to the server, put the server timestamp in there at that point. So it will end up getting populated with the server's timestamp. That's different from something like saying new date. If I say new date, I'm using the mobile device's timestamp. This is using the server's timestamp, which can be a little bit more stable because you oftentimes can't rely on the clock on mobile devices being very accurate. There's a lot of things that happen. There's a lot of reasons why the clock on the device might not be updated. So that's why we do want to use a server's timestamp over a client-side timestamp. Okay, so that's how you get a server-side timestamp. So then I just say set, just put the data in as we've done before. Otherwise, if I'm using a custom class and not a map, it changes a little bit. So I need to add another annotation called server timestamp on a date field. So in this case, I'm doing the same thing. I've got created on, it's type date, and I'm saying this is server's timestamp. Notice also that I need to make sure that that is null. Because if you read the details on that server timestamp thing, it only fills it in if the value is null. Cool? On that server timestamp annotation. So as long as that's null, it'll fill it in. If I did have a date object in there, it would just accept the date value that's there. Yes.
So you can use any name, right? As long as you put the at server timestamp line.
Yes. That at server timestamp is referred to as an annotation. So it's an annotation on an instance variable. Okay? But yeah, you can use whatever name you want there. Also notice, like, we can use that server timestamp for things like when is the document updated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or like when we did in third semester, we tracked, when were the bugs closed or classified, et cetera. You can do that. You just would have multiple timestamps on the document. Cool? And so that's a simple. There's just two different ways you can do the timestamp bit. Now, in terms of deleting documents is really pretty easy. I just say what collection is it in, what's called document to specify the ID of the document, and then I call delete. So collection, document, delete, and that will delete the document with that ID. Pretty simple. You'll get an on-complete listener here. Notice that this one is 1. Okay. The one that's different, you remember, is the one that when we call add. Add gives us a document reference. The rest of these give us void. There's also a note in the documentation just to warn you about this. We're not using subcollections at this time, but one of the things that they said is if you delete a document, it doesn't delete the sub-collections. Which I don't fully understand why that is, because to me that sounds like those would be orphaned and just kind of out there. So I don't fully understand what they mean by that, but if it does come up, we can look at it. At the moment, our schema doesn't involve any sub-collections, and so it's not an issue. If you want to read further on these class examples, You saw at the beginning on the first slide both of the two reading assignments, both the two articles that I pulled this from, those two guides. If you want to look further, here's a reference to all the different API classes that you saw in this example, right? So you look at collection reference, document reference, field value, doc ID, server timestamp, task, and I can put listener. So that gives you an opportunity to dive further should you need to while you're developing the app. Okay. Questions? So that's kind of the theory overview. Seems pretty easy, right? So most of it's just, there's really 3 new methods. We can do set, add, and delete. Or I think it's, yeah, set, add, and delete. So those are really the only 3 methods we need to know about. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and break this recording at this point.